What will you do to unlock innovation? In today's fast-paced world, innovation might not be enough. Tomorrow's pioneers of change will need to be agile, able to adapt, and committed like never before. Your host, Sana Vinding, invites you to listen in and join business leaders from around the world as they share their visions for success in our future business challenges.
Welcome to Mind Innovation. I'm your host, Sana Vinding. I'm always excited to learn. And in today's podcast, we're going to talk about teams, leadership, and culture, which all falls under people stuff. I want to welcome Zoe Routh. She's the owner of Inner Compass. She's an author, mentor, and a leadership expert. So welcome, Zoe. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Oh, Sana, thank you. This is fun.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So I always like to start because talking about the passion. So where's your passion for leadership? Where does that come from?
Passion for leadership is really rooted in passion for people. And it was in early experiences as a kid, as a teenager, when I went on my very first canoe trip with summer camp in Canada. And it was a 3-week canoe trip. And my summer camp counselor from the year before had written me a special letter saying, you should do this. You'll be amazing. You'll love it. It'll be days of sunshine and paddling and sitting on rocks, having lunch. And it just sounded fantastic. So I got onto this canoe trip, this 3-week adventure, and it rained every single day. Oh. It was like there was no sunshine. There was no sunning ourselves on rocks, and it was hard.
Yeah.
And yet I just totally loved it. And what I loved about it was, first of all, the adventure. And second of all, it was the company of other people and the ability to pull something off that is amazing, to paddle through the wilderness with 8 other people for that amount of time, not seeing anybody for all that time, was really quite astonishing. And so I think that experience really embedded in me the love of doing things together, doing adventurous things together, whether it's in the outdoors or whether it's in an organization. And the power of teams and people coming together really sparked that. And leadership is an essential ingredient to make sure that that happens really well. So that was the starting point for me. That's sort of where the passion came.
That's fun. Yeah, I already could hear in your story that it was going to rain, but good you turned it around. So I think when we look around, right, we always learn by looking around who we are among, and effective listening also give us some knowledge and perspective to become a better leader. But what do you see? How can you become a better leader? If I'm saying, yeah, I'm already listening, I'm already doing all the things that I have on my list, but I want to improve. So where do I start?
For me, one of the big shifts that leaders can make is actually in perspective. And it's the theme that underpins everything I write in my latest book, People Stuff. And we need to expand our perspective on who we are, so perspective on the self, and we need to expand our perspective on other people and expand our perspective on the bigger picture. This is actually really tough to do. To shift our way of seeing and being and doing the world is really difficult work. And I think the starting point is trying to figure out what are the patterns in what I am seeing, patterns in my own behavior, patterns in the behavior of people around me, and patterns in the greater big picture of things that are happening around me. That's the starting point of gaining perspective, is actually just looking a little bit and see what's going on. So that is a broad brush, big picture, what to do next, but that's the starting point.
That's a good one. So how do you grow it or develop it even more? Is that to write it down? Is it go to say, I find a mentor you can actually reflect it with, or how do you grow?
Well, the practice of perspective is really about going far, deep, and wide as a starting point. So this is really like looking far into the distant horizon is the starting point. And I mean that from a time horizon point of view, looking far into the future by looking far into the past. And the further we look into the past, it allows us to look further into the future.
Yeah.
So when we expand our sense of time and where we have come from and our legacy and our heritage and all the people who have come before us, over generations, that sort of expands our capacity to think long-term into the future. So rather than thinking in short-term bursts, like what am I doing for this next quarter, for this next 12 months, being able to pause and think, how do what I'm doing today, how will that cascade and trickle down into 5, 10, 20 generations from now? And when we start to ask those kinds of questions, it really does shift what our priorities are and how we think about what we do today. And the balance of focusing on now so that it influences next is one of the critical skills. So that's like the perspective of far.
Yeah.
The perspective of deep, how do we expand our perspective on leading and thinking deep, is about unpicking the patterns and the layers that are causing issues or successes on the surface. So this diving deep below the surface is the next critical skill. And in People Stuff, I run through a bunch of different tools and processes that you can do to help develop that. And one of the ones I love to point out is the problem tree. And if you Google problem tree, you'll see a whole bunch of different visual patterns for that. But essentially is a tree. You see things above the surface, the trunk, the leaves, the branches, that kind of thing. And then below the surface is all the roots.
Yeah.
So a problem tree is using that metaphor in a diagram form to dive below the surface of what we see as a visible problem. So this is a problem solving pattern of looking deep. So we like, what are the visible things that we see going on here in this environment? And then we break it down. We go, okay, well, what could be causing that visible problem? And we do 2 little branches into the soil, or 2 different roots into the soil. And out of each of those 2 factors, we then go, for each of them, we ask, well, what are 2 things that could be causing that particular problem? And then we keep going. So we go 3, 4, 5 layers down until at the bottom, we might have 8 to 16 possible contributing factors to this visible problem above the earth and the trees and branches and whatever else is causing us dramas. And what we thought might have been the cause of a problem, we identify later as maybe it's something a little bit more deep-seated. So an example of that is, let's say, what looks like a personality problem at work, right? So you got Frank and Karen. These are the 2 people I wrote about in my book. And I chose Karen before Karen became a thing.
Karen. You looked into the future. No.
Yeah, that's right. I just plucked that out and there Karen appeared in my book. So Frank and Karen, 2 very different style of leaders, and they're having conflict at work. And it's very easy to say, well, they're just so different, that's just a personality problem. But when we apply the problem tree in this example to what's going on, we discovered that Frank's motivators are financial. He's under a lot of pressure in his work unit. Like Frank and Karen work together on an executive team. And he's got financial pressures because he's got a couple people away on maternity leave. So he's short-staffed. He hasn't been able to replace them because there's a labor shortage in the market. So he's under the pump to try and deliver on getting his results out. And the other thing that we discovered by going through the problem tree is the remuneration system is actually driving him to behave in a very siloed, wolf-like, like lone wolf kind of fashion, because he gets paid on the bonuses of his team performance. And so he started trying to poach people from anywhere around him in the organization, including Karen's team, so that he could get his results, get his people, get his things delivered, so he could get his bonus at the end of the year. So that set him in conflict with Karen. Now, Karen's work unit has got a completely different situation. Their market is booming. Her team is doing really well because she's been investing in their training and development. And so they are high performing, and she's looking to expand and get more people on board too. So they've been arguing about poaching of resources and accessing of resources. And their styles are quite different, but that's not really the conflict. The conflict is really about these conditions that are generating this competitiveness. And some of it is external and some of it's internal. So, that's how we look deep into a problem, as we go below the surface and look at what are the dynamics at play, what are the systems that are at play that are setting these people up for a struggle.
Yeah, and then some of it is measure, right? How they're getting measured is a key thing.
Yeah. This is a huge bugbear in organizations, and it's a chronic issue. How do you actually reward performance?
Yeah.
Do you do it on a team basis? Do you do it on an individual basis? And there are repercussions with either methodology. And I think the answer to that is you need a combination of both.
Yeah.
And the bigger lesson that I think also is that you need a combination of intrinsic as well as extrinsic motivations for people. So intrinsic is like, I believe in the purpose of this organization. I'm motivated to develop mastery and to produce great results because it feels good and it's fun in itself. And then the extrinsic rewards are, how am I compensated for that? How am I recognized for that? So a balance of those two things builds engagement, and both of them have repercussions. And I think we need to be mindful of that. Like if we reward individuals, that can be a cascade of problems. If we reward only teams, that can have a cascade of problems too.
Yeah. What about recognitions on team where you say, hey, we struggle, or we had this project that failed, or part of it failed, and you have a recognition of saying they turned it around and telling where it was in the dark and how they pulled it through as a team, of course, if they did it. So having the whole story behind it, or the journey, I think that's a good way of doing a recognition, because we were problem solving every day. I am. So is that something you've seen, that you do that recognition on a failure, and then of course how they turned it around?
I think, of course, we need to have feedback loops built into our leadership processes, where we look at our successes as well as where we got stumped and turned over. Because if we're not learning from what didn't work, then we are not progressing. It is a failure when we don't do that analysis and we don't take the lessons forward. So absolutely, we need to do that. And plus, the other advantage of doing it is that we build a sense of camaraderie when we're faced with adversity. So when we rally together as professionals, as team members, that sense of we're in this together, we can dig ourselves out, actually builds really strong team relationships, if it's facilitated well by the leader. And I think that's the other big caveat with this one. It needs to be facilitated well.
Yeah. What about, has leadership skills, have they changed due to the pandemic? Is it for the better, or what kind of impact have you seen?
The impact is twofold. One, leaders are exhausted. So leaders have change fatigue themselves. And the reason for that is that they feel the pressure of having to be always the one rallying the troops and pointing out where the opportunities are, and trying to shift perspective on not of what we've lost, but what we could possibly gain. And that requires cortisol, adrenaline, dopamine, the biochemicals which are energizing and yet are draining. And so leaders are finding it difficult to replenish themselves. The second thing I'm seeing is that there is an elevation of facilitation skills needed for leaders. So what I mean by that is a lot of leaders are contending with hybrid teams or remote teams, and they're just not getting the same kind of emotional feedback and input through the screens, because everybody seems the way the screens work is it flattens our expression. Yeah. We miss out on the micro cues of having bodies in the same room, and which generally give us a lot of information and also pep us up. And so we miss out on the pepping nature of being in the company of other humans. And so there's this increased pressure on leaders to reboot themselves, and also learning how to build engagement through screens. And it does require finesse. It does require being able to build team dynamics. Now, the good news is all the analog skills of facilitating a team can apply through screens. So being able to set the scene and being able to get people to contribute and build safety, all that kind of stuff still applies. And I think it needs to be more intentional. So I'd say there's a dialing up of facilitation skills required by leaders. And also, I think the need to be creative is another skill that's coming to the fore. And that's been a long-term trend. That was a trend that was identified 5-10 years ago as one of the most important emerging trends for leadership skills that we need to pay attention to. So I think there's maybe a dozen key leadership skills that have been dialed up or down depending on historical context. And I think those are the two that are at the top of the leadership skill lists that have particular emphasis right now.
Yeah. So when with the hybrid, if there's some organization has the hybrid solution, some are like still remote, some are saying everybody needs to come into the office. What I'm seeing is that these organizations have, everything is a little bit different of how to have everybody in the same room or if they're on the screen. How does that impact the company culture? Because again, if you're hiring new people in, they need to have that feeling of the company culture. So again, what kind of challenges is out there right now?
I love that you bring this up. I think it highlights how deliberate and intentional leaders need to be in, first of all, cataloging or characterizing their culture and being more intentional and deliberate about it, and not assuming that because you throw people in a room that they're automatically going to get the vibe, which is what a lot of leaders do. And so the emphasis now with making sure that you maintain a consistent culture is bringing out the specifics of what that actually means. What are the values that the team and company uphold, and not just motherhood statements on a wall. It's like, we've really thought about these values, and this is how we express it each and every day. This is what it means to us. These are the founding stories of the organization and our history and why it's important to us. And so it becomes more than just something that we think offhand of. It's like, no, if we're going to hire new people into this hybrid, weird, remote environment, then we need to make sure that they know what kind of community that they're engaging in. And then we need to embed those cultural norms and practices and ethos into our daily practices, whether it's in how we manage our daily stand-ups, if we have them, how we handle our meetings, what kind of meetings, and all of our values need to be embedded into those practices as well. And it's funny, like talking to different leaders, and I've got a really stark contrast in my mind for how this works, right? So I interviewed one leader who was anti-meetings. Like, he's like, nah, we are a fast-paced IT deliverable company. We do not have time to waste in meetings. So we do not have meetings. We have an intranet, and if people want things resolved, that's where they go to get stuff resolved. And if we do call a meeting, it's under extraordinary circumstances for a very limited time. And so their culture was very much independent, hardworking individuals who come together for tactical reasons. So that was his particular approach. And that company has a very particular culture, and it suits people who are very independent and beaver-like in their approach to work. This, however, contrasts with a different kind of leader, which is a very much a relationship-based organization. And the key success for their organization is about making sure that there's strong relationships with them and their customers, and that there's strong relationships with everybody who delivers. And so they would be appalled to think that they wouldn't have any meetings, because they need those relationships, that networking, in order to facilitate solutions for their clients and to enable learning across the teams. And so they have a different approach. They have a daily stand-up. They have weekly drinks, all through Zoom, of course, because this particular leader is in a strict lockdown at the moment. And they have defined what kind of meetings that they schedule, and each meeting has a particular theme. And so people know how to turn up in terms of their thinking. So are they coming to a planning meeting? Are they coming to a celebration meeting? Are they coming to a troubleshooting meeting? And so they fine tune, and they have about 5 different types of meetings that they put in their roster. And the meetings are central to building the culture. So I love those two comparisons, right? So one is like independent workers, head down, bum up. And the other one is, no, we are networked and we are collaborative. And neither one is right or wrong. It's all about how the results you're after in a company feed into the systems that you set up for your company and your culture, and honoring that and letting people know from the outset that's what you're walking into. So one person who's a people person would struggle completely in the first company, right? Like you would feel so isolated. And likewise, if you're a head down, bum up person, you would be so frustrated with all those meetings in the collaborative culture. So when we make all that transparent and obvious, I think it makes it a lot easier for leaders, and it makes it a lot easier for the people that they bring on board to know how to operate within that culture.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. And it's also a balance, I'm sure, right? Because an organization, if you look back and looking at the history, I'm sure that company can say, hey, we evolved over these 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. A company will never stay on the same plateau. I have not seen that. So what about, I've seen that I think it's 3 in 4 employees want their leaders to have more effective, transparent communication. And it's so important that everybody is on the same page. But what if you have a leader that has difficulty, sharing that transparency? How do you start the communication, or how do you start that flow of asking for it, even if it's to your leader and saying, hey, I need to have some more transparency of what's going on? Or is people just afraid and then they just go and find another job?
Well, that's a very contextual question, right? So it depends is the big answer around that. Yeah. So if you're a worker in an organization and you feel like your boss is not sharing in a fulsome way, is kind of deflective, is trying to maintain a strong front, but there's stuff going on, very difficult if you don't have positional authority to say, hey, spill the beans, let us know what's going on. Yeah. Because you don't know what's going on for that person. You don't know what's in their personal life that's driving them to do that. If anything, you don't know what kind of pressure they're under from their supervisor and so on. So huge risk if you are not in a positional authority to say your boss, like, can you tell us more?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
So I think, do you have to just up and leave? Well, it depends what the tensions are. So your question really is like, how do we encourage vulnerability and openness in an organization? I think we dive deep below the surface, is we look at the systems that are driving that particular behavior. Yeah. So it becomes not a personality issue with the person at the top. It's like, what are the systems that are preventing them from being open and transparent? And maybe it's the accountability system, maybe it's the reporting system that's keeping them from being able to share particular things, or there might be parameters in which they operate where they don't have the scope to be able to share. So I think when we have a look at the systems, then that gives us a little bit of leeway in order to share that with our boss. And so the conversation could be, rather than please stop, stonewalling us by not telling us anything, which is setting you up for a conflict conversation too. Yeah. I noticed that we have this reporting system that prevents us from getting effective feedback on issues in the organization. Is there an opportunity to review how we do reporting? Say, for example, is there an opportunity to review how we get information about the performance of the company? So it becomes a suggestion about how we shift systems as opposed to how do we shift somebody's approach. And by shifting the systems, you have a cascade of change behaviors potentially. Yeah. So that's a lot to have a look at if you're somebody who's just trying to get your job done and you think my boss won't tell me what's going on or isn't giving us the whole picture.
No, so it's pulling it back to the communication, right? To have some good conversations and have that, and then push it, or not push it, but share that transparency.
I think it's pulling you back to perspective first, rather than putting yourself in opposition to the person you think is the problem. It's zooming below the surface and going, okay, what else is going on for this person? And maybe it's looking at what are their motivators. So there's their patterns of behavior. And in people stuff, I talk a little bit about this. If you're dealing with negative behaviors, the chapter is the 4 devils of people stuff. Then you can look at what's triggering that negative behavior. And that's helpful to understand how then we can approach them. So diving below, looking at people's drivers as well as the systems are 2 ways to start looking at it. And then it's the communication piece, which is, okay, knowing what I do now or having hunches about what I think could be going on, how do I then broach the subject in a way that invites communication, invites a collaborative solution to this, as opposed to an accusation, which is where we often feel like, if we feel like we're being slighted by our boss in particular, or even by a colleague, then we can go in all defensive or offensive. And that just is a cascade of issues right there if we go in with that kind of mode.
Yeah. What about, so again, back to the company culture, and it also, I'm sure it's also touching actually communication, but so measuring the engagement in a company, or how happy, or the happiness in a company. I've seen a lot of surveys that you can see there. That's Gallup. They have one as well. And how important is it, or is it more trending that every company will like to have this because then they have something they can measure? What is your recommendation if you want to go in and look at of your employees, of the engagement that's right there?
I think it's difficult to benchmark against another company culture because every organization is its own ecosystem. So I would, caution people against having a set of results, whether you use the Gallup's 12 questions in terms of your survey and comparing it to another organization. That doesn't really help because each organization has its own ecosystem. Yeah. I think it's important that we do get a baseline and get some information from our people about how things are going. I'd prefer to see it on a team by team basis. Because I think people have different perspectives, right? So their experience on their individual team might be different to how they perceive the whole organization. So I think we need to be aware of micro teams, of cultures between teams, as well as the perspective on the whole organization. An easy way to do it is to sort of get, if you want a numerical benchmark and you want to be comparing to yourself and previous results, is to use the employee net promoter score. Yeah. Which is the easy rating, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this team or this company to somebody else as a good place to work? And then you can calculate based on those results where your starting point is. But, one score is just a point in time. You need to keep asking it over a period of time with the intention of asking, so what? So if they rated a 2 out of 10, which is bad. Yeah. Why? What's going on? So then it's an invitation to, again, dive below the surface and figure out what's going on there. So there's so many different instruments for this, Culture Amp has another really fabulous platform where they have very complex assessments that you can implement into your own organization that give you fine-tuned details. And I think it also depends on the size of the organization as well. Bigger corporates will have more nuanced reports needed and bigger resources to do that. If you're a smaller company, then I think you can go with something like the employee net promoter score and a couple of open-ended questions and have regular communication with your team about it, as long as it's front and center. And I think with any measurement, though, you got to be asking, why are we doing this? What is the end outcome we want? If we're measuring it, we want to be improving it. And so what does that look like? And how will we tell? So it's like designing your measurement system with the results in mind and being able to improve it at the same time.
I think one of the questions on the Gallup is, do you have a best friend at work? And everyone can answer that in different ways. And with all the diversity that is in different companies, right? A best friend, is that the one you grew up with? Is the best friend one you can go and have fun with and have lunch with? Is that best friend the one you can vent together with because something happened in the company? I think that question can have so many different answers because it has the word best friend. I don't know if they still have that in there, but I've seen that there was a lot of, I've seen a lot of communication around it because people just answered it differently. And then it's difficult to benchmark on it or have a baseline on it if you're not answering on the same ground.
Oh, I think that's true of all the questions, really. Like, it's how we interpret what they mean. Yeah. I think the intent behind the question is what needs looking at. The intent behind the question is, do you feel safe? Do you feel welcome, wanted, and needed? Yeah. And though that's sort of what's implied in that question. Having a best friend means that you feel like you feel safe, you got someone to trust, and that you feel like you belong. And I think there's different ways of asking that question than using the best friend one. And again, it also depends how big the company is, and the structure of the company. like the company I mentioned, which is the beavering company, where people are just working autonomously, it's not relevant to them, right? It's not relevant to them to have a best friend because they're autonomous units, and not even appropriate. Like they would say that doesn't matter to us whatsoever. So I think we need to keep in mind context of each organization before we start designing or adopting any surveys like that.
Yeah. Do you have any good recommendation on how to motivate people to better engage in a company?
Motivation versus inspiration is a perennial topic, right? So motivation is carrot and stick conversations. And I think carrot and stick conversations are really difficult. I think it comes back to the extrinsic and intrinsic reward system. So if you find that somebody's not motivated in the company, the same principle applies, right? Dive below the surface. What's going on for this human? Is there something in their personal world that's decreasing their desire to show up? Is there something in the systems at place at work that are getting in their way, preventing them from achieving outcomes, which is demotivating for them? I think you need to ask the bigger questions, like how aligned to the purpose of their work and the organization as a whole is this human? Do they really understand what the company is all about? Is that clearly expressed? Do their values align? So I think there's some really deep layered questions around and values and purpose that need to go into it. Just casting something in front of somebody is not a useful methodology. If you look at some of the work of Dan Pink in his book Drive, he talks about 3 things that's necessary for good work. He says purpose is one, which we just spoke about. Mastery, the opportunity to mastery skills, is another way of building engagement. And autonomy is the third, which is, do I have capacity to make decisions about my own work on my own? Or am I working in a very strict, regimented way and I've got no fluidity and opportunity to make decisions? So he says those 3 factors are really important for engagement. And some of the other research I did in writing people stuff added a 4th one, which trumped all of those actually, which is recognition. Feeling recognized, and doesn't need to be financial. It can be simply acknowledgement of a job well done, with specifics outlining, what was it specifically that you did and how did it have an impact on other people? And it takes 30 seconds to do that. And this is what's amazing, like something like 55% increase in employee engagement when non-financial recognition was implemented. And this is a report from 2019. Wow. That came up with that. So you can have an incredible impact on performance, i.e. employee engagement, simply by saying, Sana, that was a really wonderful way that you set up the podcast. I really liked how you set up your show. Your guests are really engaging and the tone is just right. And you have a great curiosity that invites people to have conversations. I can't wait to see what's next. Something like that, which takes 30 seconds, which lights up somebody else, gives them a positive boost for the day. Yeah, is such an easy thing to do. And I think as leaders, we need to keep in mind of always catching people doing something right. That's something I learned 20 odd years ago as a new manager. And my boss gave me a series of books. She said, here, read this. It's called The 1 Minute Manager by Ken Blanchard. Yeah. And I'm like, gobbled that book. And that's the one thing that stayed with me all this time, is like, catch people doing something right. Okay. And all the research is continue to support that. That is a really important methodology of trying to get people engaged in what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree. I got so happy when you said good stuff on my podcast.
Yeah, I could see it. I could see it light up, even though, I'm doing this through a screen. It's like, oh, that's nice. Thank you.
No. So we learn every day, but we also learn, what we from the past. So, but what will you tell, sorry, if you were like to look 10 years ago, what would you have told yourself?
I recently did an exercise around this for myself. And then the context is that this year, it was 25 years since I arrived in Australia. So I've been in Australia, having moved over from Canada 25 years ago. I'm like, wow. Trying to rewind what was life like and who was I 25 years ago, and got some great insights. So 10 years ago, shorter time frame. And so I'm 51 now, I'd be 41 then. And where was I working? I was still working at the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. I think the key messages that applied to 25 years ago, that applied to 10 years ago would be, you're not as crap as you think you are, which is, I think, a common theme for many leaders, is that they suffer with imposter syndrome. They're very self-critical, and they have trouble seeing their own superpowers. And so I think that's a nice little reminder to myself, or if I could tell myself at the age of 41, you're probably better than you think you are. That would be the first thing. So a little bit of a boost there. And the second one would be, just keep learning and leaning into learning. And it's in learning that we grow. And I think that's a really useful message to, and it's something that you say too, we're always learning, always wanting to learn. I think that's a key message for whatever stage of our career we are at, is to keep learning and leaning into that. And that's probably the third message would be, look after your health. And that's a pretty big fundamental piece. And that's easiest thing to let slide when you're feeling well, and easiest thing to remember when you don't.
Yeah.
So I think make that a primary responsibility.
Yeah. I think with the health one, it's like put money in the bank, stay active, eat healthy as much as you can, but it's money in the bank later on when you get older. But I love your observation like that. It's like, what are you investing in? And one of the things I've started asking myself too about choices that I make today that affect what's going to happen next is filtering every decision with is this for my current self, or is this for my future self? Is what I'm eating now for my current self or for my future self? And sometimes it's like to satisfy my current self right now, because that chocolate looks really amazing. And will my future self appreciate that? Is kind of the filter, what decisions am I making today that I'm investing in my future self? And I think that's a really useful frame to help us make important decisions, whether it's around priorities or whether it's impulsive choices, that kind of thing. Yeah. So thank you so much, Zoe, for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed it. I love the people stuff. I actually like the title of your book. Just call it People Stuff. I love it. And I also love the whole problem tree that you said, because there's so many more behind it, right? And when you ask, but why did we do this, and then actually ask the questions to go deeper. So I really enjoyed it. And I also love your learnings, or your advice to yourself. I think keep learning. When I got out of college, I was like, no more, right? And then a couple of years later, I was like, I need more. And then I've been on this journey of saying, I want to learn more. So thank you so much. It was really great.
Oh, thank you so much, Sana. This was great fun. And thank you so much for the work that you do in the world. It's really important to get learning, lessons, insight out into the world. So good on you.
Thank you. If somebody wants to reach out to you, how can they find you?
They can find me at my website, zoerouth.com, which is ZoeRouth.com, or on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active there, and as well as across the other social medias. And I have my own podcast too, the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast.
Awesome. So listener, subscribe to both of them. Okay. Thank you so much. If you enjoy this podcast, maybe you'd like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure also to check out our website, mindtheinnovation.com. And remember, stay curious and keep learning.